I had become used to surprises by this time, but I must confess that even I was shaken when one day Hitler calmly said to me, "Bauer, get ready to fly Ribbentrop to Moscow in a few days' time." A party of 35 was to be flown to the Russian capital, and as our Focke-Wulf Condors could carry up to 20 passengers, that meant 2 planes. Late in the afternoon on 21st August 1939, I landed on the Reichenhall aiming airfield to pick up Ribbentrop, who was with his staff on his country estate at Fuschl. Shortly afterwards, he and the others arrived in cars, with 2 lorries bringing up the rear with their baggage. We managed to pack it all away, but it meant that we were heavily loaded, and it wasn't too easy to take off from that small airfield. We flew to Königsberg and spent the night there. I and my crews were up early in the morning getting our machines ready, and I was studying the route the Russians had laid down for us, which was not, to my surprise, the direct one. We were to avoid Polish airspace and set course Donauberg, Veliki Luki, Moscow, arriving at the aeroport on the River Moskva in 4 hours and a quarter after the takeoff. As I circled the airfield before touching down, I realized that a big reception had been arranged. There were Soviet red flags with the hammer and sickle, and German red flags with the black Hakenkreuz on a round white ground, flying everywhere. There was a guard of honor drawn up and a military band with shining brass instruments. Ribbentrop was the first to get out of my plane, and he was heartily welcomed by the Soviet Foreign Minister, Molotov, whilst the military brass band played first our national anthem and then theirs, whilst everyone stood at the salute. Ribbentrop then marched along with his arm raised in the Hitler salute whilst he inspected the guard of honor. My God, I thought, wonders will never cease. Ribbentrop and his party and the Russians then drove off in a fleet of cars into the town. Ribbentrop stayed with the German ambassador, Schulenburg, whilst those with him were quartered in hotels. I remained on the airfield for the time being, where our planes were the centre of a great deal of attention. The Focke-Wulf Condor was famous throughout the world by this time because of its non-stop flight from Berlin to New York, a sensation for those days, and its non-stop flight to the Far East. The machines looked good too. Aerodynamically they were excellent, and undoubtedly they were not only amongst the most powerful, but also the most beautiful planes in the air before the war. The Russian experts made no secret of their admiration. The Russian foreman had at one time worked on the Königsberg, Moscow line, and he spoke quite good German. He produced the necessary mechanics and so on, and work started at once to prepare our machines to take off again the following day. As usual, at the end of a journey we had a good deal of food and little luxuries of various kinds over. White rolls, cake, biscuits, chocolate and so on, all neatly packed. As a general rule, we had no difficulty in getting rid of them to make room for our supplies for the homeward journey, but this time my mechanic informed me that the men engaged on our engines and the women who were cleaning out the inside of the planes all refused to accept them. I got hold of the foreman, who spoke German, and asked him what was the matter. He smiled and said that Russians had enough to eat. I replied, yes, of course, I was quite sure they had, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't a question of charity or feeding the hungry, we just didn't want good stuff wasted. He still smiled and said no, it was forbidden. I then told my mechanic to put the baskets with the stuff on a bench in the hangar and leave them there. The next morning, when our fresh supplies arrived, those baskets were all empty. There are more ways of killing a cat. A little later, a squad of photographers arrived, complete with small ladders. They were pretty poorly clothed, and they wanted to know whether they could take photographs of our condors. "Carry on," I said, and at that they photographed our planes from every possible angle. They all seemed very surprised that they were allowed to take photographs at all, and astonished that they could go anywhere. Even so, they really couldn't believe that they would be allowed to photograph the engines, and their leader came specially, and very doubtfully, to me to know whether they might. And when I said yes, he looked at me in vast astonishment. When everything had been settled and the work was well underway, Lier, the pilot of the second machine, and I decided to go into Moscow itself. Our crews were to live in the machines, get their food there, and generally keep an eye on things, because naturally we were alive to certain possibilities. But, in fact, the Russians intervened. Whilst we were preparing to leave, a man in civilian clothes came up to me and addressed me in excellent German, informing me that he was in charge of the GPU, the Russian secret police. He had been instructed to guard our machines. I told him we preferred to do it ourselves. "Oh no," he said, "that was impossible." He had strict instructions. A hangar had been made ready for our machines. They would be rolled into it and locked away and the key handed to me. GPU troops would then undertake the outside watch. We were guests of the Russian government, and it was difficult for me to object to this arrangement, which seemed all right, so I agreed. When everything was ready, the two machines were trundled into the hangar, the doors were closed and locked, and I was given the key. A messenger from the German embassy then handed us 200 rubles each, declaring that we probably shouldn't need any money, but it was better for us to have just a little. It did seem a little to me, so I pointed out that the possibility of being able to tip freely was a great lubricant when you wanted anything done quickly, and that I had always been allowed to do what I thought best in that respect. How was I going to get on with 200 rubles? I was then informed that tipping had been abolished in Russia. I wondered, but gave it up. After that, we all drove into town. Leah and I were quartered with the German military attaché, Herr von Köstring, whilst our crews were given rooms in the Hotel National, an in-tourist establishment. When we had washed and changed, we went down to dinner. Nothing about it seemed very Russian, but von Köstring immediately explained that it had all been brought in at embassy instructions from Poland and Sweden. It was cheaper that way. After our meal, we naturally wanted to see the town. We were given a German Baltic girl as an interpreter, and we set off with her in a car provided by the Russian government. As we left the building, she pointed out the GPU post whose job it was to watch all comings and goings. A man would now telephone to GPU headquarters to inform them that a car, number so-and-so, containing so-and-so many people, age, sex, and so on, had just left, going in whatever direction it happened to be, and giving the names of the passengers, if they happened to be known. After that, our interpreter explained, another car would tack itself onto us and follow 50 yards or so in the rear, and wherever we went and whatever we did, the GPU would be on our heels. Once again, we were urgently warned that the taking of photographs was strictly forbidden and that any attempt to use a camera would get us into serious trouble. I had already discovered this at the airfield when Zintel and I had taken our Lycus with us. "For heaven's sake, Captain Bauer, don't attempt to take any photographs," the representative of the German embassy had said. "Best of all, leave your cameras behind altogether." "I know better than to take photographs on an airfield," I said, "but surely in the town a visitor can snap this or that interesting building." But no, this wasn't so. No photographs at all, or else. We assured the girl that we wouldn't dream of taking photographs. We hadn't even our cameras with us. After looking at the Kremlin, we drove out to a hill from where we had a wonderful view over Moscow. After having driven to see all the sights, we returned to the German embassy and stayed there until well past midnight. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer, was then called to the Kremlin to take pictures of the final scenes at the discussion between Stalin and Ribbentrop. He returned full of enthusiasm. Early next morning, Leah and I and our crews were back on the airfield to take our machines up for a trial flight before flying Ribbentrop's party back to Germany. We had found no opportunity of buying anything during our short stay in Moscow, and everyone else gave the money back, but I thought it would be a shame. So I asked our girl interpreter to give it to our Russian driver, who had driven us around all day and half the night. She was sure he would refuse it, but I said that he looked as though a couple of 100 rubles would come in useful, and I urged her to try. So when we came to the airfield, she leant forward and offered him the rubles. At that there was an explosion. The man was furious. He wanted to know whether this was the thanks he got for having done his best for us, to get him into prison. We knew perfectly well that it was forbidden to take tips, and so on. We did our best to calm him down, and in the end we parted good friends, and I too gave my rubles back to the embassy. Soon after that, our machines were waiting ready on the tarmac to take off. Ribbentrop arrived with his party and the Russian Foreign Minister, Molotov, who was all smiles and said goodbye to Ribbentrop with great friendliness. Before the takeoff, we were in touch with Berlin and received instructions not to fly to Obersalzberg, where Hitler was at the time, but straight to Berlin. He would fly there in the meantime to meet Ribbentrop on his return. We made a short intermediate landing in Königsberg, and soon after that we touched down in Berlin, where Hitler was anxiously waiting to hear Ribbentrop's report. For weeks after that, I listened to discussions at table in the Reich Chancellery concerning the results of the negotiations in Moscow. As there were new guests constantly, Hitler had occasion to deal with the matter again and again. He was very satisfied with what had been obtained, and he said so frequently. In addition, his opinion of Stalin had changed, and this astonished a good many people. For example, Hitler once remarked that Stalin's career had really been rather like his own. Stalin had come from below to the top, and he, Hitler, knew better than anyone what it meant to have worked your way up from being an unknown man to being leader of a great state. At that, some shocked guest declared, "But my Führer, you really shouldn't compare Stalin with yourself. Why? He was a bank robber." Hitler brusquely rejected the observation and declared that if Stalin had actually robbed any banks, then it had been not for himself but for his party and his movement, which was a very different thing and not to be regarded as bank robbery in the ordinary way. Another result of Hitler's changed attitude towards Stalin was that the Eher Verlag, his own big publishing house, and all the others, were given instructions to pulp their stocks of anti-communist material, an order which gave rise to a good deal of doubtful head-shaking. The negotiations with Poland did not have the desired result, and Germany invaded Poland. In my opinion, Hitler ventured that far only because he felt sure that Great Britain and France would not intervene. I can well remember the morning on which the ultimatum was handed to the Polish ambassador. Hitler and Ribbentrop, with a number of other people, were in the smoking room at the Reich Chancellery, and Hitler declared positively, "I can't imagine the British and the French going to Poland's assistance. They're bluffing, Ribbentrop. You'll see, they won't come in." Ribbentrop didn't agree with him, and said so. He also added that all his information suggested that the British and French were serious and would come in. Hitler remained unconvinced, and when the British and French declarations of war were handed over, he consoled himself with the thought that war with them would have been unavoidable in the long run anyway. So it was better that it should come now, since it would free his hands to carry out his plans for strengthening and consolidating Germany. Several times he declared positively that the war could not last more than a couple of years, and he was so firmly convinced of this that he told Speer not to reckon with much more than 2, or at the utmost 4, years for the various industrial buildings and plants made necessary by the war. With the war, a new routine life began for us. I flew Hitler to Krösinsee, the ancient monastic stronghold in Pomerania, where there was an airfield, and from there he made short flights to the front. A little later our base was pushed forward to Oppeln in East Prussia. On our flights over Polish territory we often had to land on ordinary fields and meadows, which made things difficult for our escort of fighter planes. We usually had 6 with us, and splinters were common. The fighter planes were so fast that ordinary fields just weren't big enough to provide the necessary run. Sometimes it happened that we had only a couple of fighters to escort us on the way back. The others had suffered such damage in landing that they were unable to take off again. When the German troops were at the gates of Warsaw, we landed about 18 miles away in a stubble field. Hitler was to arrive by car. A concentration of about 5,000 guns had already opened the final bombardment of Warsaw, and Hitler wanted to see the effects from the air. He hoped that it would lead to the surrender of the town. Soon after he arrived with his staff, the order to take off was given. Everyone except myself was already on board. The engines were running, and I was just about to climb into my seat when an army car raced up. An officer jumped out and declared that he had an urgent message for Hitler. I reported to Field Marshal Keitel, who informed Hitler, who then got out of the plane and received the message in person. I was standing just behind him when the officer declared that he had the sad task of informing the Führer that General Fritsch had been killed in action. He had gone forward with a company against a Polish position and been shot down by machine gun fire. A bullet had ripped open an artery in the thigh, and the general had bled to death within a few minutes. Hitler briefly expressed his regret and then got back into the plane and gave the order for the takeoff. With a fighter escort, we now flew over the front lines at a height of between 6,000 and 7,000 feet, and we could easily see the devastation being caused in the suburbs of Warsaw. After cruising around over Warsaw for about 30 minutes, we returned to our landing place, and shortly after that Warsaw offered to capitulate. A few days later, Poland as a whole surrendered. A great victory parade was to take place in Warsaw, and I flew Hitler to Warsaw Airfield. A great number of high officers were present to receive him, and discussions took place on the spot with large quantities of maps. After about an hour, Hitler got into a car and was driven into the centre of the town to take the salute at the parade. I waited behind on the airfield with my crew, and food for about 100 was simmering in field kitchens. When it got to 15 hours, I asked the major in charge of the catering to give us our food, because when Hitler came back, we should probably have to get away quickly, and the last-minute preparations would probably not allow us time to eat. Tables had been laid in an empty hangar, which had been specially brightened up for the purpose. There were white tablecloths and even flowers on the tables. In fact, it all looked very attractive. But there was Hitler's well-known Puritanism, which was narrower than ever in time of war, to contend with, and I communicated my doubts to the major about his spread, telling him that I didn't think he'd get any thanks from Hitler for his quite extraordinary performance. However, the major declared that it was impossible to ask Hitler to sit down and eat at a table without a tablecloth, so I made no further objection. The great column of cars arrived from the centre of the town at 16 Uhr, and Hitler marched into the hangar with his retinue, including Field Marshal Keitel. He gave one look at the festively prepared tables and demanded who had given orders for a state banquet in time of war. Keitel didn't know, and inquiries had to be made to discover the culprit. Hitler was furious, and turning to me, he snapped, "Is everything ready for the takeoff, Bauer?" When I told him that it was, he marched off to take his place in the machine, leaving the prepared tables behind and forcing his retinue to do the same. Field Marshal Keitel and the others were hungry, and now they were furious, but there was nothing they could do about it. They didn't get anything to eat until we landed some hours later in Berlin. In the autumn I flew Ribbentrop to Moscow a second time, once again with 2 Condor machines. This time I and my crew were quartered in the Hotel National, in honour of Ribbentrop, who sat in the former Tsar's box, which was now Stalin's. The Moscow Opera Company staged a ballet evening, which included the famous Dying Swan. The Russians had naturally spared no pains to make the evening a success, and from the artistic standpoint it certainly was. But what we found astonishing was the audience. Some of the ladies had done themselves up as well as they could, but their clothes looked as though they had come out of grandmother's rag bag. And as for the men, you would have said that they had just come from the workbench. They didn't even wear ties, and none of the ladies seemed to have hats. Of course, the Russians had more urgent matters to attend to at the time than developing their textile industry. Later on, when I was their prisoner of war, I noticed that the secretaries of high officers and so on did have good clothes and hats, but not in the autumn of 1939. After the opera, Ribbentrop met Stalin for the final discussions. Hoffmann was once again asked to the Kremlin to take photographs, but the rest of us stayed in our hotel. When we had gone to our rooms, I remembered something I wanted to say to my mechanic, Zintel. So I went out into the corridor to go to his room, and I found that each of our doors was guarded. Perhaps it was for our protection, and it certainly meant that no one could get anywhere near us unobserved. The next morning we had breakfast in the hotel and drove straight out to the airfield. This time, too, Molotov accompanied Ribbentrop to his plane. As before, the main item of discussion at table in the Reich Chancellery after this visit was its results, and once again Hitler seemed very well satisfied. In fact, he declared quite frankly that, but for this new agreement, food would have become short in Germany. And politically, he hoped that the conclusion of the agreement would have some effect on the British. Ribbentrop and Hoffmann had to tell Hitler about their experiences and their personal impressions in Moscow. Ribbentrop declared, amongst other things, that Stalin had drunk so much vodka that at first he had been sure that only water was in his glass. But later on he had been given an opportunity of seeing for himself that it really was vodka. This wasn't the first time, and it wasn't to be the last, that the Russians demonstrated their simply fantastic qualities as consumers of hard liquor. The only man in the German party who had been able to keep up with them was Hoffmann, who was a mighty consumer of strong drink before the Lord. Even Stalin had noted his performance with appreciation and had drunk a personal toast to him. On 8th of November, I flew Hitler to Munich for the traditional 9 November celebrations in the Bürgerbräu Keller. Shortly before we touched down, Hitler asked me whether it would be possible for him to be back in Berlin at 10 on 10th November, because there was an urgent discussion which he was unable to postpone. I pointed out that November was the month of mists and fogs, and if there happened to be one the next day, I couldn't guarantee anything, as it could easily postpone our takeoff for hours. In that case, he said, he would return to Berlin by train. At this time, he had no special train of his own, and a special carriage was coupled to ordinary timetable trains for him. And as it happened, in order to catch a suitable train, he had to leave the Bürgerbräu Keller much earlier than he would otherwise have done. Less than an hour after his departure, a bomb obviously intended for him exploded, causing damage and a number of fatal casualties. Hitler spoke as usual from the same spot where, on 9th November 1923, he had fired that famous shot into the ceiling. The would-be assassin had laid his plans and made his preparations with this in mind. At first, the police investigations came up against a blank wall, but a man had been seized on the frontier at Constance just when he was trying to climb over the fence into Swiss territory. A German frontier guard had seized him by the feet and hauled him back. The arrested man gave his name as Müller. His real name was Georg Elser, Ede, and said he was a mechanic. In his pocket they found a piece of bronze which proved to be identical in kind with the alloy used in the manufacture of the Bürgerbräu Keller time bomb. Asked why he was trying to get into Switzerland illegally, the man declared that his reasons were purely personal. Questioned concerning the explosion in the Bürgerbräu Keller, he denied all connection with it. However, he had a sister living in Munich, and he had been living with her. A search of her flat at first produced nothing sensational, but on the wall there was a traditional Schwarzwald cuckoo clock. A detective noticed that it was not going, and remarked that with a mechanic in the house it ought to have been easy enough to put it right, whereupon the woman said that her brother had, in fact, worked on it, but without success. The clock was then taken away and examined, and it was discovered that a number of wheels were missing. Amongst the bits and pieces collected from the infernal machine were those very wheels. There was no longer any reasonable doubt as to where that machine had come from and who had put it there. In fact, when faced with the evidence, the man confessed. The questioning of his sister produced the fact that Müller had said that he would soon be going to Switzerland, where he would be able to earn a lot of money working for a Frenchman. Himmler appeared in the Reich Chancellery with a film of the whole investigation, but Hitler refused to look at it, saying that he didn't want to see the swine. However, Himmler showed the film, and I was amongst those invited to see it. Müller had insisted under examination that he had made the whole ingenious piece of apparatus himself, and the Gestapo was very anxious to know whether this were true or not. So Müller was provided with the necessary materials and did in fact make working diagrams and then build an exact copy of the infernal machine which had gone off in the Bürgerbräu Keller. Under examination, Müller declared that he hated Hitler and had determined to put him out of the way. He knew, of course, that he would find it very difficult, if not impossible, to get anywhere near him in the ordinary way. So a time bomb set to explode at the traditional celebration in the Bürgerbräu Keller on 9th of November seemed the best solution of the problem, particularly as the exact place where Hitler would be standing was known, and also the time at which he would be there. The Bürgerbräu Keller was not guarded particularly, and he had found an emergency exit through which he could get into it easily without attracting attention. Weeks ahead, Müller had manufactured his bomb and prepared where it was to go, quite close to the spot where he knew Hitler would be standing. For this he prized off wooden boarding and took out a brick or two behind it, replacing the wood over the cavity and sweeping up everything when he had finished, so that things looked exactly as they had done before. On 8th November, the day before the meeting, he got into the hall again and placed his infernal machine in position in the hole he had made for it, setting the mechanism to explode for the time when, in the ordinary way, Hitler would have been there. Then he put back the wood boarding and walked out of the place, leaving absolutely nothing out of the ordinary to be seen. Before the meeting, the Gestapo naturally searched the hall as a precaution, but Müller had been too clever for them, and nothing was found. At first, Müller was to have been brought before the Volksgerichtshof, or People's Court, and publicly tried. But Hitler decided against this, and in the end, the man was secretly executed. In November 1939, I was instructed to fetch King Boris from Sofia, and I landed there with my Condor on the ordinary civil airfield. My journey was secret, and I had a passport made out in the not very imaginative name of Schmidt. In accordance with the instructions of the German Foreign Office, I presented myself to the German air attaché, Colonel Schönbeck, who looked at me suspiciously and said immediately, "Schmidt? Your name's not Schmidt. I've seen you somewhere, but I just can't place you for the moment." Of course, I had to insist that my name really was Schmidt, but just at that moment my mechanic, Zintel, came up to tell me something and addressed me as Bauer. After that, I had to explain the whole thing to Colonel Schönbeck, telling him who I really was and why I had come, adding that King Boris's departure was to be kept secret. It wasn't a very good start, but at least I had played my part properly. Shortly afterwards, I received instructions from the German embassy to leave the civil airfield and land on a military airfield not far away, where the machine was to be looked after for the night. I did my best to carry out those instructions too, but when I tried to take off I discovered that the ground was too soft. It had rained a good deal since I had landed. I just couldn't move, and nothing I could do made any difference. 50 soldiers were mobilized with spades and bowls of wood. Even then it took hours, but in the end a tractor pulled the Condor out of the mud. Then at midnight it started to freeze, and that was my salvation. I took off at dawn and flew to the military airfield. At Odin 8 Euro, King Boris appeared, accompanied by his brother and a general of the Bulgarian Air Force. Nothing moved on the airfield. Everyone had been given instructions to stay out of sight, and the big field looked absolutely deserted. King Boris was in civilian clothing, and he recognized me at once, for I had already flown him from Zurich to Vienna. He asked all sorts of questions about the weather forecast and so on, and showed great interest in various technical details. When he travelled by train, he would often go into the locomotive cabin and drive the train himself. He knew nothing about flying, but he asked me if he could sit up in front. My mechanic gave up his seat next to me, and we started off in the direction of Berchtesgaden. The weather wasn't bad, and as the king was so keen, I gave him his first flying lesson, showing him how the machine reacted to gusts of wind and how deviations could be corrected. He was astonished at the readiness with which the great plane answered to the slightest movement of the controls. On a quiet stretch, I actually let him fly the plane himself. He was a very good pupil, and by the time we had landed at Einring Airfield near Reichenhall, he had learned quite a bit and was looking forward eagerly to the flight back. He was received by Hitler, spent the night in Schloss Klesheim near Salzburg, and the next morning I flew him back to Sofia, during which time he had another lesson. He thanked me warmly before he left us at Sofia and assured me that we should often be flying together in the future. This turned out to be true, for I flew him on many occasions during the war. In December 1939, we flew into the Saar district, and from there Hitler made flights to various parts of the front. At that time, of course, the offensive in the west had not begun, and with the exception of one or two spots, all was quiet. Just before Christmas, Kannenberg, who was in charge of the household at the Reichschancellery, made up Christmas parcels for the men of Hitler's bodyguard and for those in his immediate circle. I knew how gladly Hitler liked to give, and how particularly delighted he was when his gifts were appreciated, and he happened to say to me that it was a shame that he couldn't go out shopping and choose the presents himself. I said that he ought to do what Goering did, go to a shop after closing hours and have the whole staff waiting on him. Hitler laughed and said that such a method of shopping no doubt suited Goering, but personally it didn't appeal to him. After Christmas visits to various parts of the front, we flew back to Berlin. Before the launching of the offensive in the west, the famous organisation Todt built headquarters for Hitler on the Ziegenberg in the Taunus. Reich Minister Todt arrived in the Reich Chancellery to lay plans and photographs before Hitler. As he looked through them, however, Hitler grew more and more dissatisfied. "This is supposed to be a military headquarters," he snapped, "and yet I see there are wood carvings, wrought ironwork decorations, and thick carpets on the floors. Do you really think I'm going to occupy a headquarters like that? Later on, thousands of German citizens will visit this place. Would any of them possibly understand how I could live in such luxury in wartime?" Todt defended himself and said that the Reich Chancellor had certain representative duties, so that in the circumstances the installation was not unnecessarily luxurious. But Hitler refused to be persuaded. "You can do what you like on the Ziegenberg," he declared bluntly. "I won't be there." With that, a feverish search started up for a new headquarters. A suitable spot was eventually found in the Eifel, and this headquarters was called Felsenest, or Rock Eyrie. The blockhouses were bored into the solid rock, and a special airfield was laid out near Euskirchen, about 8 miles away. Hitler moved in just before the opening of the offensive in the west. In the meantime, the Chancellery was a hive of activity. High naval and military officers were constantly coming and going, and it was quite obvious that something big was in the offing. But what it was, I didn't know and didn't learn until the invasion of Norway had actually started. For a while after that, all the table talk at the Reich Chancellery was about General Dietl and the difficulties of keeping him supplied, for shipping losses were heavy, and in fact, for a while it seemed touch and go. But finally it became clear that the invasion was a success, and then everyone breathed again. Hitler was delighted at the way Dietl and his men had carried off the daring coup, and he was convinced that their deed would stand out in history. Also, he was overjoyed when intelligence informed him that the German invasion had forestalled the British by only 24 hours. When the fighting was over, Terboven, Gauleiter of Essen, was appointed Commissar for Norway, and I was instructed to fly him to Oslo. On the day of the flight, the weather was very unfavourable, and the landing was particularly difficult. Oslo Airfield is a rock plateau, hewn out of solid granite. As far as you can see, there isn't a blade of grass, just rock and nothing but rock. While behind it the town rises up still higher. It was no joke landing a big 4-engined plane there, particularly as the actual landing strip was narrow and little more than 1,000 yards long. And to encourage any pilot coming in to land was the sight of plane wrecks to left and right of him as he touched down. The least deviation from the straight and narrow would have meant the destruction of the plane. I managed it all right, but I breathed a sigh of relief when we finally rolled to a halt, safe and sound. The next day I flew back to Berlin and reported to Hitler that Oslo Airfield was quite unsuited for normal Luftwaffe use. One morning I was ordered to take 3 Condor planes to Hamburg that same evening. Hitler was to come on afterwards by train. The flight was to be kept secret, and in Hamburg I was to arrange for a sufficient number of life jackets to be taken on board. Everything was to be ready for a takeoff at 6 o'clock the following morning. When I arrived in Hamburg, I had some difficulty in getting hold of 50 life jackets, but I succeeded, though not without making it an open secret that Hitler was flying to Oslo to visit his troops in Norway. I stayed the night in a small hotel in Fuhlsbüttel, and I was up very early the next morning. At 4:30 I was sitting down having my breakfast when I was called to the telephone. It was Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, von Below. "Just a moment," he said. "The Führer himself is coming to the telephone." Hitler wanted to know whether everything was ready for the takeoff and whether the life jackets were safely on board. I was a bit puzzled at this, because when I was given instructions to do a certain thing, it was usually assumed that I would do it. No one, and certainly not Hitler himself, ever rang up to inquire whether I had in fact carried out my instructions. But then Hitler said, "I know I can trust you, Bauer. You've done everything you were told to do, but in the meantime 1 or 2 things have changed. I want you to come to me at once." "Where to?" I asked. "To my Felsenest headquarters. Touchdown at Euskirchen. The fact is that the Western offensive started this morning. You were sent to Hamburg to make all those preparations in order to mislead enemy intelligence, but come straight away now. I need you urgently." I took off very early and flew to Euskirchen. The offensive in the west was going forward rapidly. There wasn't, in fact, a great deal for me to do with my condors, but my Fieseler Storch planes were kept very busy taking Hitler's military adjutants backwards and forwards from his headquarters to the various command centres. When difficulties arose, Hitler's opinion was taken direct to the commanding general in this way. After a few days, I began to fly Hitler more and more often into French territory, where we landed for him to discuss matters with his generals on the spot. We always set off from his Eifel headquarters and returned there, but by this time it was really too far away from the fighting, which had rolled deep into France. Hitler therefore ordered a more suitable place to be found as quickly as possible. I flew Colonel Schmundt, the adjutant-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, into the Ardennes on this quest, and we landed in a field not far from Rocroi. It had been decided that the new headquarters should be established in some out-of-the-way village, and in Rocroi we found a small hamlet of about 10 cottages on the verge of the Ardennes woods, which, we decided, would do very well. The church tower was taken down and put to one side, with the intention of putting it up again when hostilities were over, and the whole building arrangements were carried out by the organisation TOT within a matter of days. A special underground concrete shelter, or bunker, about 10 feet down, was built for Hitler. Most of the inhabitants of the little village had already fled into the interior, and those few who were left we moved away. The new headquarters was occupied by Hitler as soon as it was ready. The nearest airfield was about 3 miles away on French territory, and my crews were quartered in a small village in the neighbourhood, but the headquarters itself was on Belgian territory. When not actually in use, our machines were kept under camouflage netting in the nearby woods. We had our own wireless station, storage bunkers, and recreation huts for us to stay in during waiting periods, quickly run up by the organisation TOT. From here we were constantly flying to Reims, Charleville, Lille, and so on. I flew Hitler into Lille immediately after the town was taken, and the fact that he appeared so soon after the fighting certainly made an impression on the civilian population, which was precisely what he had aimed at. He ate all his meals from field kitchens like the men, though in his case the meat had to be removed first. Made wise by the story of the overzealous major in Warsaw, which spread like wildfire, no one again tried to present any improvised banquets for Hitler in the field. Our most successful fighter wing was stationed in Charleville at the time. I flew Hitler there to inspect it, and he personally decorated Galland, its commander. Goering happened to be with Hitler at the time, and whilst he was waiting, being greatly interested in food, he casually asked a cook in charge of a field kitchen what he had been in peacetime. The man replied that he was a smith by trade. Goering was furious. He sent for the catering officer and dressed him down. "I see you make smiths cooks, so I suppose you make cooks smiths, and mechanics bakers, and bakers mechanics." We hadn't heard much about the Führer's deputy, or in other words, Reich Minister Rudolf Hess. But after we had been in our new headquarters a few days, he arrived in a Jushina 52 flown by Captain Doldy. I happened to be at the airfield in a small army car, and Hess got in beside me and drove straight to Hitler, who met him in the local school building. Apparently Hess wanted to be allowed to make a tour of the front, but Hitler refused, declaring that it was essential that he should always have someone in Germany in his absence on whom he could rely absolutely. Hess must therefore take no risks at the front, but return at once to Munich. Hess was obviously depressed at Hitler's decision, and the next morning when I drove him to the airfield, he relieved his feelings to me. So you see, that's how it is with me, Bauer. But I'd sooner be a company commander at the front than a Reich minister at home. In wartime, an able-bodied man ought to be at the front, not miles away stuck in some office. When I think of my job at the moment, listening to and arbitrating in endless party disputes, I wouldn't mind it so much in peacetime, but now, in wartime. He inspected our installation, we had about 40 machines at the time, and then climbed into his own Ju-50 and flew back to Munich as he had been ordered. When Paris fell and the tide of war rolled southwards beyond it, Hitler decided to visit the French capital. On the morning fixed for the flight, our airfield was shrouded in a thick mist, and I had to take off blind. But as I knew every inch of the airfield by this time, there was very little danger. We landed at Le Bourget at 5 o'clock in the morning, because Hitler wanted to get his visit over and done with before the Parisians were on the streets. I went along with him on his tour through the town. Workmen were tramping along going to the factories, the street sweepers were just starting their jobs, and the concierge were beginning to open up the front doors. From the airfield we drove along the Champs-Élysées to the Arc de Triomphe and the grave of the unknown soldier. Then we visited the Louvre, the Trocadero, the Eiffel Tower, the Paris Opera, and finally, the Invalides, where Hitler was particularly interested in the tomb of Napoleon. By 6 o'clock, we were back again on the airfield. The takeoff was delayed because the air had gone out of the tail wheel tire, and whilst he waited, Hitler stood and talked with a group of Frenchmen, mostly workmen and mechanics. On the way, he had been recognized now and again, although very few people were on the streets at that early hour. So far, the campaign had proceeded exactly according to plan. Then France surrendered altogether, and Hitler enjoyed a triumph over doubting Thomases, who seemed to have been wrong after all. They weren't, though. Shortly before the campaign ended, and when it was already quite clear that Germany's victory would be complete, Mussolini came in. Hitler was not at all impressed by the showing of the Italians. He said contemptuously that they had come in only when they were quite sure everything was going to be all right, and even then the French had given them a thrashing in Savoy. But now they were making ridiculous claims. For example, they wanted Tunis. As the crown of his Western campaign, Hitler now had a special titbit in mind. The railway carriage in which the German plenipotentiaries had signed the armistice agreement in 1918 was still standing as a showpiece in the forest of Compiègne, and Hitler had long decided that the French should now accept and sign the German terms in that same carriage. This was done, and Hitler then declared with satisfaction that the last remnants of the Versailles Slave Treaty had now been wiped away. As a result of this historic act, Germany's honour was restored in full. We now left France, and after a short stay in his new headquarters in the Black Forest, Hitler flew back to Berlin. We were now equipped with new Condor machines, armed with 4 machine guns, 2 above and 2 below, so that there were no blind spots anywhere. The same type was introduced into the Luftwaffe. They had 4 engines of 1,000 horsepower each, and they could stay in the air for 15 hours at a time, long enough to allow them to fly far out into the Atlantic from Bordeaux and return around the north of Scotland to land in Norway. Inside they were much the same as our old Condors, except that now each seat was provided with a built-in and unobtrusive parachute. By Hitler's seat there was an emergency lever with a red handle. When pulled, it opened a space beneath him, which could be used to leave the machine by parachute in the event of urgent danger. We had unexpected trouble with the first of our new Condors, though they were splendid machines. I had flown it to Berlin from the Focke-Wulf works at Bremen, and I wanted to make a number of test flights, particularly to try out the new wireless equipment. The machine was ready to start on the first of these trips, and I was just about to climb into the cabin when suddenly the whole thing collapsed with a loud crash and lay there on its belly, looking somehow very forlorn. A white-faced Zintel appeared at the cabin door and looked out at me in horror. I wondered what on earth had happened. The arrangement of the various levers was different from that in our old Condor, and Zintel, not knowing this, had pulled the lever which in our old Condor removed the brakes from the wheels in readiness for the takeoff, but which in this new Condor drew up the retractable undercarriage. Fortunately, no one happened to be standing underneath at the time, or there would most certainly have been a fatal accident. A certain amount of superficial damage was done, which meant that the machine would be out of commission for a few days, and as Hitler wanted to use it quickly, I had to report the matter to him. Fortunately, he didn't blame Zintel, but the Focke-Wulf people for changing the arrangement of the levers. Discussions were necessary from time to time with Laval, the Prime Minister of the Vichy government, and I would fly to Dijon, pick him up there, and fly him to Obersalzberg. After the discussions with Hitler, I would fly him back to Dijon, from where he would return to Vichy by train. But one day I was told that the rest of France was now to be occupied, and that this time I was to take Laval on from Dijon, where fighter protection would be waiting for us, to Vichy. I was warned in particular to be on my guard against any attempt to detain me. When we got to Dijon, the fighter escort hadn't turned up, but fortunately ground mist was reported from Vichy, so that Laval had no idea what was really causing the delay, which was a good thing, because it was essential that he should not learn prematurely that we distrusted him. Our fighter escort turned up half an hour late, and I arranged with the squadron leader that when I landed, the fighter escort should circle round over the airfield. I would keep my engines running and take off again as soon as Laval and his companions had left the plane. In the event of trouble, I was to fire signal rockets. Shortly before midday, it was reported from Vichy that the ground mist had cleared, and we were able to set off, with fighter escort. Before leaving the plane, Laval asked me if I could stay for a while, as he would be very happy to have me to lunch, but mindful of what had been said to me, I excused myself by saying, truthfully, that I had been given orders to return to Berchtesgaden at once. Laval expressed his regret, thanked me for my services, and got out to inspect the Guard of Honour which was drawn up to greet him, whilst I took off at once. I flew back with the fighters as far as the demarcation line, when they turned away to return to their base, leaving me to fly on alone. German bombers were over Belgrade, and the German drive against Yugoslavia had begun. Throughout the campaign, which did not last very long, Hitler's special train stood about 15 miles outside Wiener Neustadt, with its locomotive constantly under steam, so that in the event of an air raid, the whole train could be quickly drawn into the safety of a nearby tunnel. The neighbourhood was so mountainous and broken that it was impossible for me to find a suitable landing place anywhere near, so we had to stay in Wiener Neustadt and maintain a shuttle service with Mönchskirchen, which was the nearest village, using the small Fieseler Storch planes. Hitler stayed in his special coach the whole time, even celebrating his birthday there. Shortly before the victorious ending of the Yugoslav campaign, I was sent to Sofia to pick up King Boris and the Bulgarian Premier. Usually the king was in civilian clothes, but this time he had put on uniform. We landed in Wiener Neustadt at 09:00, and from there King Boris went by car to Hitler's special train. Before he left, I told him that if he wanted to return to Sofia that day, 17 Nakwan would be the latest time for the takeoff, as otherwise we should arrive in the dark and perhaps be mistaken for British planes and be fired on by his own Akak. Hitler, I said, had given me strict instructions not to fly him after dark. The time I had mentioned came and went, and King Boris hadn't turned up. I waited for half an hour, and then I ordered the planes to be rolled into their hangars. King Boris turned up at 20:00 and pretended to be very surprised that no planes were ready for him. "We must fly to Sofia at once, Bauer. It's most urgent." I want to announce on the wireless in Sofia this evening that Hitler has promised me Macedonia and the Mediterranean harbour of Burgos. I reminded him of what I had said that morning. Hitler had absolutely forbidden me to fly him after dark, though, if he cared, I said, I would be perfectly prepared to fly the Premier and the other gentlemen back. During the subsequent conversation, I discovered what had delayed him. On the way to Hitler, he had sighted a castle that had belonged to one of his great-aunts, a place where he had spent a part of his youth. A sentimental feeling had made him want to visit it again and see what the old place looked like. I then suggested that he should drive back there now and spend the night, and drive in again early in the morning to fly to Sofia. "I can't do that," he said. "The old lady got hard up and sold it long ago. It belongs to someone else, and I don't know a soul there now." In the end, it was arranged that the king and his companions should spend the night in the Hotel Imperial in Vienna. We were to take off the following morning at 09:00, and at 08:30 the engines were running. But then a telephone call came from the Hotel Imperial, postponing the start until 11:30. The king, it appeared, had had a wonderful night in wartime Vienna. "My Bulgarians won't mind my having had a bit of fun," he said when he finally arrived. "Not when they hear what I've got to tell them, and it was wonderful for me to be able to behave like an ordinary citizen for once."